And good evening, folks. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 10 in our discussion of Inferno. And tonight, we are actually going to get into discussing the seventh circle. We kind of mostly got down the slope to the seventh circle last time, but this time we're doing it. We're just going to do it. We're going to talk about the seventh circle today. So we're going to be discussing the violent. We'll see how far amongst the violent we get. But of course, one thing to... Well, hang on a second. Before I do any preambulatory material, let me do some preambulatory material and give a couple announcements. One quick announcement, just to mention, I've been mentioning this, but the deadline is actually coming up soon. TextMoot. So TextMoot is happening on the 13th of February, our second virtual moot of the year. I hope that folks would, I know there's a bunch of people already signed up. It's going to be a great crowd. It's still, the deadline that is approaching is that it is still possible to present at TextMoot. So if you go to textmoot.org, you can find all the instructions for submitting ideas or proposals for that. And I definitely recommend that. TextMoot is going to be a lot of fun. And then the second announcement, I talked about this last night. I'll try to talk about this in less detail today, but I'm very excited about it. I've mentioned in the past our Signum Academy Clubs program. It's the Signum's newest program, which we're launching this coming month. We're starting it up officially. And our clubs program are extracurricular programs in the language arts for school kids from grades 3 through 12. And we're doing book clubs, we're doing creative writing clubs, we're doing language clubs. That I've announced before, but the exciting news is that we were just approved by the Board of Education of the state of New Hampshire to participate in a brand new program called the Learn Everywhere Initiative in New Hampshire, which means that by participating in our Signum Clubs program, high school kids in the state of New Hampshire can actually earn school credit through participating in our programs. They participate in our programs. We give them we do our assessments. We give them a certificate, and they can cash those certificates in for graduation credits in their schools. It was a long and rigorous process that we went through, but we have completed the process. We were unanimously approved. So the Signum Clubs has been evaluated at a really high standard. For educational substance and quality by the Board of Education in the state of New Hampshire, and definitely, Kid, as you say, homeschoolers can and absolutely should use these on their transcripts. Absolutely, that is something that's. I mean, the downside, of course, it's not exactly a downside, but sort of the limitation of the announcement is that it's, unfortunately, New Hampshire is the only state in the country that has this kind of a program. So unfortunately, it's only high schoolers in the state of New Hampshire who qualify for direct participation in this program. But the really exciting thing, I think, the sort of wider group that can benefit most broadly from this are homeschoolers. And I know that a lot of people, homeschooling is at an all-time high since the pandemic began. And I know that there are a lot of people who are homeschooling and a lot of people who would be really interested in some excellent, reliable, professional supplementation on the language arts front. And we're going to have a bunch of options for that. And since we've been through, we've gone through all of the, the bureaucratic hoops with the state board and stuff. So we will be able to provide, certificates and, all the things that whoever oversees your homeschooling in your state, whether it be your school district or the Board of Education or whoever it is, will be able to speak their language and tell them about the mastery of the competencies and show them the assessment patterns and everything. We'll be able to do that. And so it's something that should be a really very useful tool for homeschoolers to be able to participate in our clubs and be able to sort of use those towards their home. And again, we can't promise that because we don't know, different states and how things work, but we're confident and we're ready to work with folks to try to give them support homeschooling families however we can. I think it should be a really fun opportunity. So if you are interested in participating, if you've got kids who might be interested in participating, or maybe you're part of a homeschool group who would be interested in learning more, maybe setting up a group, you could have your own discussion section basically from your homeschool co-op. We could do that too. Get in touch with us. academy@signumu.org is the contact email to reach out to, and we would be happy to talk about any of these things. Tomas, unfortunately, this is just for high school students. I know there are a bunch of people who are like, "Hey, I wanna do language clubs like this and stuff." It would be fun, admittedly, but for now, just unfortunately available for not just high schoolers, but also middle schoolers and upper elementary as well. But there it is. Yeah, I know. It's adults grumbling about this. It's hard. But in fairness, we've been doing, broadcasts and programs for grown-ups for a long time. So it's kind of fair, now to give kids a chance. So, Michael points out that youth continues to be wasted on the young. I know, it's true. It's always been true, certainly. Anyway, okay. So that is just a reminder of what's happening now. Now let's talk about violence. So, one of the, we spent almost 2 classes now, the last 2 sessions, discussing the sort of subdivisions of hell and how things are working and everything. I wanted to offer kind of a few general reflections to begin with on the circle of the violent, on the 7th circle of hell, and then we'll go in and we'll sort of look at how this has worked out. Basically, thinking about, we discussed the Aristotelian foundation of it, right? We discussed, we talked about Virgil's explanation of how the lowest 2 circles, the worst part of hell, the places where the things which anger God most are contained, are subdivided. All of it is malice. Malice is what's down there, right? Malice is the overall category. Malice subdivided into malice by force and malice by fraud. And malice by force is violence. And that, of course, subdivided by whom the violence is directed against, right? So we have the 3 different zones in the 7th circle: the violent against others, the violent against themselves, and the violent against God. And those we will see in cantos 12, 13, and 14, respectively. Okay. But I didn't just want to do a review. What I'm wanting to think about is, on the one hand, it's one thing for Virgil to say that basically it's been Aristotelian all along, right? That the upper circles were incontinence and that the lower circles are malice. And as we talked about mad bestiality, I'm not sure where mad bestiality is. Sure. And I'm not saying it doesn't work, and I'm not saying that that's not consistent, but when we get into violence, the question becomes, or rather my question, let me just say, not pretend like it's a question which objectively exists. My question is, what's the difference? I mean, we mentioned this a little bit, right? I mean, like, we saw folks being there no end violent against each other, right? Up in the swamp of the Styx, right? With what's his name? Filippo Argenti. Right, the one that Virgil kicks and then like ends up chewing on himself while everybody else beats the crap out of him. I mean, there was a lot of violence even from Virgil, right, going on, and Dante was like, "Let me at him." So like there was a lot of violence there, so what's the difference? What's the difference exactly? Why are these people in what's so? I mean, apparently. The difference is malice, right? We've got those who did not restrain their desires and those who committed violence by through malice, right? But the question that I keep coming back to is, okay, is it about the act? Is it about the act? Like, is there something intrinsic in the act? Because it seems to be about the act. Like it would, I mean, the sort of labels, right, that are being placed on thing seem to be about the things that people did, especially down here, right? Less so up top, right? Like the gluttonous. I mean, okay, I guess that's about, eating, but that's a more general, it's not, there's not like a specific, I mean, okay, again, you can say eating, but it's not just eating, right? Gluttony involves more than just eating food. Gluttony is a frame of mind, right? And that's, of course, what we saw. It was a question of priorities, right? It was a question of like the way in which, in the sphere of the lustful, right? Or not sphere, circle. It's not a sphere. In the circle of the lustful, they suppressed reason, right? They chose passion over reason. They elevated passion over reason, and that was their mistake. So like, it's not about, and we talked about this some at the time back when we were talking about Canto 5. It's not about sex, right? It's not like, did you have sex with the wrong person? If so, that's the ring that, that's the circle that you go to. It was always not exactly just about the action. But violence seems to be an action. And to differ perhaps from the wrath, right? The sort of more, unfocused wrath that seemed to be going on up there in the Swamp of the Styx with Filippo Argenti and friends. So does that mean like it's one thing to just kind of generally be wrathful, right? But if you cross a line, right? I mean, is that what it means? Right? Like if you cross the line, so like it's one thing if you're just somebody who is like, angry and a jerk to people, that you end up, in the Swamp of the Styx. But if you actually cross the line and beat them up or kill them, then down to the seventh circle for you, right? And it seems like that could be one way to understand this, but I don't think that that's right. That doesn't seem to me to fit what we what we see. And it just doesn't seem to me to really make sense. I would think, or rather, let me tell you what I would expect to see, right? If that were true, then the emphasis would need to be on the actions, right? Like what did exactly they do, right? But yeah, and Gerald, I agree with you that the intent does seem to matter, right? Certainly the thought or the intent precedes the act. Probably it requires both, but again, the determining thing, right? What decides whether you go down to circles 7 through 9, right? Down to the bad place in the middle, with circles 7 through 9. What is malice, right? Which is about intent. It's not about action. It's about intent. Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Stephen, to be reminding us about that famous passage in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, like, if you are angry with your brother in your heart, you're still guilty of murder, right? And that is exactly, it's one of the reasons why a fixation on the deed alone, right, as the determining factor. Again, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it would seem a little bit odd for that reason, exactly, to say like, yeah, no, it's not, it doesn't matter what was in your heart. What matters was what you did outwardly. That would seem strange under the circumstances. Yeah. So it does seem to be about a distinction in the nature, or the tenor, perhaps, of the intention, right? Of the will behind the actions. And therefore, one of the conclusions that I already am suspecting, and I think probably we'll see after we continue our journey through the seventh circle, if I ever permit us to do that, is that it's violence itself, though it sounds like a mere physical description, right? I mean, that seems pretty clear, right? Those who are violent, okay. But clearly the concept of violence or force, right, malice by force, is fairly broad. And so it's one of the things that one of the questions that I find myself most interested in thinking about as we go through the seventh circle is, what does he mean by violence exactly? What is in fact the state of a soul who is guilty of violence against any of the targets in question, self, others, or God? And I think that will be an interesting thing to look at as we go through. And certainly we will see lots of different categories, right? The word is going to be used in what would seem to be some sort of figurative senses or less direct senses, right? Fairly quickly. So that said, let's actually do it. Let's take the plunge. Down to the seventh circle we go. This is the last slide we did last time. I promised we'd talk about the parentheses, so I'm going to fulfill that promise. I'm a little hesitant. Here's why I'm hesitant. I don't understand it. I'm going to tell you right now. I think I understand the elements that underlie it, but I don't understand what Dante is trying to suggest by them. So here's what we'll do. I'll try to explain as best I can the elements that I think he's invoking here. And then you can help me figure out what he's doing, how he's putting all these things together. So, okay, so remember he's describing why is there a landslide here, right? Like, why is there, this landslide of rocks that they're climbing down? How did it get there? And you'll remember that it happened, there was an earthquake right before Jesus came through the gates of hell, Herod Hell, right, took the blessed dead out of limbo and carried them off with him to paradise. So he says, I would have you know, the other time that I descended into lower hell, this mass of boulders had not yet collapsed, because of course it was pre-crucifixion. But if I reason rightly, it was just before the coming of the one who took from Dis the highest circle's splendid spoils, that, on all sides, the steep and filthy valley had trembled so, I thought the universe felt love, by which, as some believe, the world has often been converted into chaos. And at that moment, here as well as elsewhere, these ancient boulders toppled in this way. Okay, all right. So, the elements here. What is the connection between love and chaos? All right. So, the world is composed of chaotic elements. Everybody knows this. The fundamental principle of how creation works at its most basic level, right? If you want to go down to medieval metaphysicians talking about this kind of thing are kind of like physicists talking about quarks, okay? We're talking about component parts, not elements, right? Not even electrons and neutrons. We're talking about quarks here. What is the basic what are the things made of that make up all things that make up all things, right? So, like, for instance, in the human body, you might talk about, how your body is, a balance of several different humors. But those, in turn, are related to and connected to the four basic elements that make up the entire universe. But those elements, in turn, are made up of other things as well. And so that kind of basic level of the universe, at its most basic level, like, what are the elements made of? The elements are made up of different of contraries that are in chaos and at war with each other, right? This is what God does. If you read Genesis 1, of course, what you find is that God's primary actions in Genesis 1 are organizational, right? Like God imposes order upon the world, and that is very much how the medievals saw the creation process. That the matter itself, like the basics of matter, are in chaos, are in discord with each other, are contraries that are at war naturally, and God imposes order on them. And so the basis of, I was about to say life, but it's not. But don't talk to me about life. No, but sorry, we're just reading Hitchhiker's Guide with my son. But anyway, it's not the basis of life. It's the basis of matter. It's the basis of everything. Is expressed in what the medievals would say the Latin phrase concordia discors, that is the concord of discordant elements. There is this fundamental tension between these chaotic contraries and them being kind of held together. They are being sort of held together, and that's like the basis of all things. So you take these fundamental contraries, which are things like hot and cold, wet and dry, and you bring them together, and those are what, in different combinations, and those are what make the elements. But again, everything is like fundamentally wanting to sort of fly apart, and it is the love of God which imposes order on things. Now, why is it then that Virgil is talking about love converting things into chaos, if it's love which basically is the only thing that's maintaining concord among the discordant things? Here he seems to be referring to a pre-Christian theory, the Empedoclean theory, which says that if the discordant elements were actually were to be brought into real concord, not just tension, right? Not just a kind of stasis, right? But into actual, if there to be concord, then chaos would erupt, right? Then like the whole system would break down. So if we understand love to mean as like synonymous with concord, right? If the discords, fall into a unison, then they'll fly apart. And that seems to be what he's referring to there. Now, why is he referring to this? This is what I don't know. So elements, concordia discourse, right? And the tensions upon which order is imposed on chaos by the love of God, according to the medieval Christian theology. This idea of if you eliminate discord, then it brings chaos, which comes from the pagan world, but again was still an idea that was again, remember, they rejected wholesale relatively few pagan ideas, because the pagans they were ancients, they were really wise, everybody knows that. So you don't just chuck it out, and you might try to explain. Sometimes they're just wrong. Even Aristotle got some things wrong. Like, for instance, he thought that the world was eternal, right? That the universe itself was eternal and did not have a beginning. He was wrong about that. But it's like a pretty short list of things that Aristotle was wrong about, after all. But hey, nobody's perfect. Okay. So we've got those like metaphysical concepts going on in the background. But then we also have this moment. Virgil is thinking about chaos descending, and he's associating this descent of chaos with the earthquake, right? The steep and filthy valley had trembled, so I thought the universe felt love, by which, as some believe, the world has often been converted into chaos. He thought for a second, the earthquake was so tremendous that he thought for a second things were flying apart, right? Like, Empedocles might have predicted because of the unexpected concord come about. And that's what he means, I think, when he says, I thought the universe felt love. Concord, that is, unity, right? Which, in the case of the universe, according to Empedocles, is disastrous. Okay, so in other words, he's saying, one way to paraphrase Virgil's words there is, that earthquake was so bad, I thought the whole universe was flying to pieces, right? That's one way to paraphrase what he's saying. But here's the other thing. Remember what we're actually talking about. And I hate doing this because she knows like 10,000 times, more than 10,000 times, more than I do about Dante. But I have to disagree with Berolini here. In Berolini's commentary in the digital Dante text that I've been encouraging everybody to use, and to enjoy her commentary because it's fantastic. But I have to disagree with her here. And what I disagree with her on is not her reading of Dante, really, but her reading of her connection to events in the Bible. I think she's missing something here. She talks about the earthquake as if the earthquake were a consequence of Jesus's arrival, of the harrowing of hell. But it's not. That is not the earthquake that Dante is describing here, that Dante the poet, that Virgil the character is describing here. It is not the fact, as Berolini seems to imply, or seems to assume, I don't know, that basically when Jesus arrives at the gates of hell and kicks in the gates of hell and brings out the saints, that in that moment, right, like the concussion of Jesus breaking in the gates of hell is what causes the earthquake. It's not what causes the earthquake. It's very clear on that. He says it was just before the coming of the one. The earthquake didn't happen when he came. It happened right before. And of course, we know what earthquake he's talking about. Because, of course, exactly as Bruce was just pointing out in Matthew 27:51, we're told it is at the moment of Christ's death that there is an earthquake. Like in Jerusalem, we're told there's an earthquake, right? The Gospels record an earthquake happening at the moment of Jesus's death, which, of course, logically would indeed be just before his spirit comes down to hell, right? So yes, Jesus has just died, his corpse is still nailed to the cross, and here he comes, right? Now he's coming to descend to hell. That's exactly what we would expect. So the earthquake which caused the damage here is not the earthquake of Christ's coming to hell. It's the earthquake associated with his death, with the crucifixion itself. And that, to me, seems to me to be completely... Well, I won't say completely. It seems very significantly to change the analysis that Berolini is doing. And again, I'm not questioning her analysis of Dante. I'm questioning the connection to Scripture that she's working on there. Because to me, it makes a pretty big difference. Quite a big difference. She speaks of the concussion of Christ's coming as like an evidence of how, like, the weakness of hell and its being able to stand against Jesus, right? Like Jesus's arrival is so tremendous that like hell itself like shivers and is damaged by it. Now, I'm not saying that's terrible reading, like, no doubt, like that could be, but that's not what's being described. What damaged hell was not Jesus's advent to the underworld. What damaged hell was Jesus's death. And Jocelyn, no, I do not think there are two earthquakes. There is but one earthquake. This is happening at the same time. I don't see any reason to question that the earthquake which the Gospels record as occurring in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus's death is the same earthquake that's happening, that the tremors of like the ripple effect of the death of Christ on the cross is what causes the shuddering of the entire world. And now I come back to Bruce, thinking along very similar lines to You Are Here. I'm coming back to the question of love, right? Virgil's like, it was like a love quake, right? Well, yeah. If it was the crucifixion quake, then yes, it was. It was. This greatest expression of God's love and sacrifice for humanity. But it's not only that either. It's yeah. Ken, am I postulating a physical earthquake? Yes, or rather, I am postulating that the physical earthquake, the Gospels record a physical earthquake, so that's like a fact, right? That's one of the facts that we're coping with here, right? That earthquake was felt in hell suggests, William, maybe it was a spiritual earthquake. Well, yes, it certainly was. I mean, the moment of Christ's death on the cross, that echoes of that are felt both physically and spiritually, would seem no strange thing. Again, especially thinking about Christian doctrine and Jesus as the union of God and man in that way. Both physical and spiritual earthquakes, Jennifer. Exactly. That there, I don't think there's a distinction here. Jocelyn, I love the idea that there is actually a phenomenon in seismology called love waves. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Does the actual geological phenomenon of love waves allegorically map onto this? I bet you we could make it do. I bet we could turn that into an allegorical trope for the love of God, but I don't know enough about that seismological feature to do it. But that's pretty cool. Anyway, okay, so now there's another element here, right? There's like another layer then that has to be added on top, though. This is Virgil saying this, and Virgil doesn't understand. Virgil does not himself. Virgil's a pagan. Virgil is not necessarily a not that he's an unreliable witness. It's not that I doubt his testimony of what he's saying, but I mean, I'm sure the earthquake did happen at that point. But that's not what I mean. But does he understand? I mean, the fact that he admits here that his interpretation of the event was, of course, as should not be shocking, based on a piece of pre-Christian metaphysics, right? Of pre-Christian cosmology. Does Virgil understand himself? Really? What happened at the crucifixion? To what extent does he understand that? He seems to, he knows about God and he understands how things work generally. But David, I am also inclined, as you're suggesting, to hear some dramatic irony here. Absolutely. That we understand, perhaps, again, as that educated Christians reading this text in the Middle Ages would understand better the significance of that earthquake and what it has to do with love and chaos. So I don't think I have a real joined together reading of this passage exactly. Like, what do I think Dante the poet is trying to get at, or what are the, how do we exactly understand this? But what I would need to think about more is the connection between the crucifixion, that is the moment of the death of Jesus, as distinguished from the moment of the harrowing of hell, which is immediately afterwards, and the moment of the resurrection, which comes after that, right? Those are all three of those are important metaphysical moments, but they're different metaphysical moments. And this is where that's the sort of footnote that I would give several of you who were talking before about associating the crucifixion of Jesus with the love of God, and obviously that's true, but the death itself, the resurrection. I'm not saying the crucifixion isn't associated with, but okay. To be more precise, what I'm saying is don't lump everything all in together, right? It's not just about the sacrifice and the atonement, right, as a whole package, right? It's about the death specifically, about the crucifixion, exactly. Remember, at the moment that this earthquake is happening, like the echoes of Jesus's voice crying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" are still like ringing out somewhere, right? That's the moment when this earthquake happens. Love and chaos, right? God incarnate has just died. Love and chaos. Is the world flying to pieces? For a minute there, it looked like that might be what's happening, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if, the Apostle John, standing at the foot of the cross, might not have thought the same thing about the world flying to pieces in that moment. So anyway, so there's me not answering the question, but I hope I sort of raised enough issues. Maybe we can keep kind of wrestling about it and thinking about it. But I better move on if we're actually to get to the seventh circle of hell tonight. So we passed the Minotaur and down we go. And we meet centaurs down at the bottom, and we meet a centaur who threatens them. And the centaur who threatens them, well, he's about to explain. "My master told him, 'We shall make reply only to Chiron when we reach his side. Your hasty will has never served you well.' Then he nudged me and said, 'That one is Nessus, who died because of lovely Deianira, and of himself wrought vengeance for himself. And in the middle, gazing at his chest, is mighty Chiron, tutor of Achilles. The third is Pholus, he who was so frenzied. And many thousands wheel around the moat, their arrows aimed at any soul that thrusts above the blood more than its guilt allows.'" Once again, we find mythological figures who are both fitting to be among those souls whom they're surrounded by, right? That is, like Nessus. Is Nessus guilty of violence against others? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the centaurs were famously violent, in more than one sense. But they're both in the sense of they're likely to murder you, and also in the sense that they're likely to rape you. That was sexual violence was very strongly associated with centaurs in Greek and Latin tradition. And this is a kind of a trend. Same with fauns, right? Same with fauns. If something is part human and part beast, that's probably a bad sign, right? That probably indicates that the human reason of this person is not completely driving the bus. And that seems to be, again, there's a correlation there. And just as we were kind of talking about with the Minotaur, right, and his head, his beast's head on his human body, the Minotaur, of course, is the product of unnatural desire. The mating of Pasiphae, the human queen, with the bull, and which again was about, well, it's about lots of things, but you can say certainly the desire of Pasiphae is often given as an example of subordinating reason to desire, right? yeah, yeah. Um, Devora says, I don't know if I can see Mr. Tumnus the same now. You know who agrees with you, Devora? Tolkien. I strongly believe that this was one of the very first things that put Tolkien off Narnia. He got as far as Mr. Tumnus taking Lucy back to his cave. And this is why he wrote that famous letter to Lewis saying, what are you doing? Like, you can't do this kind of thing. And Lewis, of course, is openly playing with it, right? With the books on Mr. Tumnus's shelf. Lewis knows the tradition fully well, right? And of course, it is deliberately playing on that. I mean, you have a faun, and what is the first thing he does? He seizes a young human lass and takes her back to his cave and kidnaps her, right? I mean, that's the way it is. Yeah. So, no, and I'm not, of course, please nobody misunderstand. The point is Lewis was changing that, right? He was playing on that tradition, and he was altering that tradition, but he was deliberately playing on that. But Tolkien was not cool with that, just because he's like, no, you can't do that. That's not how fawns work. You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Anyway. Okay, enough about Narnia. Back to Hell. Now, you're right, Jennifer. Yes, that Chiron is the one singled out by Virgil that is as the only one they'll speak to, right? And he is famous. On the one, he's still a centaur, right? And he's still down there with all the other centaurs, but he is famously wise. He was known for he was the tutor of Achilles and others. So he was a famous wise teacher, but still a centaur. Reason was higher than average in him, like average for centaurs. But still, at the end of the day, centaur. Yeah. Now, Bruce, you notice, of course, the human-animal hybrids are especially clustering around down here, right? Medusa is technically a human-animal hybrid with the snaky hair, but it's a little bit less. It's more of an accessory, than something essential. Not to mention the fact that we're not even 100% sure if Medusa was really there or if the Furies were just jerking Virgil's chain. But anyway, here we get first the Minotaur and then the Centaurs. And so this seems to me to be our first kind of hint as to what the kind of thing that's being punished down here, right? Which, of course, I can't help but think about mad bestiality again. Mad bestiality being that third Aristotelian category that Virgil cites, right? Incontinence, the inability to control yourself, malice, and mad bestiality. And as soon as we descend into malice, what do we find? Mad beasts or mad part beasts, right? And the harpies, David, exactly. We're going to get to the harpies very soon too. Also, human beast hybrids there as well. The human beast hybrids come thick and fast down here, and that. So I don't know. So I'm beginning to think that mad bestiality is kind of an overlay, right? It's maybe more than it's, there isn't a place for it. It's I don't know what, but I still don't really get it, but it seems to be involved here. But again, in trying to think about how to understand what does it mean to be violent against others, right? Now let's think about Nessus. Nessus, who died because of lovely Deianira. This is one of those things you're supposed to know. Dante assumes that you're familiar with this story. And in case you're not, Nessus was a centaur who fell in love with Deianira, but she was already Heracles' girl. Nessus tried to rape her like centaurs do. So like he, grabs Deianira and he drags her off. Heracles catches up with him and shoots him with his bow, with his arrows that are tainted with the Hydra poison. Heracles has his famous bow of poisoned arrows, bow with poisoned arrows. Yeah, exactly, Bruce. So this is the one with the shirt, the blood shirt. So he Nessus is dying, right? Nessus gets Heracles' poisoned arrow, and he can tell that he's dying, and he's still got Danaera there, right? So he tells her, he's like, Heracles is one day he's going to tire of you someday. So here's what you do: take this shirt, dip it in my blood, and that will serve as a love charm. So if you ever worry that, you know, Heracles is straying on you and thinking of leaving you for someone else, have him put this shirt on and it will bind him to you in love forever. And she was kind of a sucker and believed him, and she does it. She dips it in his blood, which was, of course, tainted with the Hydra venom, so that when eventually, of course, it does happen, and Heracles is wandering off, and she gives him the shirt, and he puts it on, it kills him. The venom like works in through him, so he's in this like shirt of poisoned pain, in which his own poison is coming back to him, and that's ultimately what kills him. So that's what Virgil means when he says, of himself wrought vengeance for himself. Of himself, of his own blood, wrought vengeance for himself, brought about the death of Heracles. Okay, great. Now, allegorical. Let's think about that on the allegorical level. What does that mean, and what does that tell us about the violent against others, right? Nessus is one of our first clear exemplars of the violent. I guess, okay, the Minotaur was our first exemplar, but our second exemplar here is... though he was kind of marginal in the sense that he's on the margins, right? He's on the boundaries there. Of himself wrought vengeance for himself. His own cause of death brings about the death of his enemies, or his enemy, singular, his great enemy. This link that Nessus's example establishes between his vengeful desire to destroy his enemy, which is violence against others, right? Definitely malice involved with Nessus, no question. And his own destruction, right? His own death, his own self-destruction. The blood that was, coming out of him, his life blood spilling out, that was, in the moment of his death, is made into the instrument of his violence. And so again, this link between, and of course, it's also a link which redounds on Heracles himself, right? Heracles' act of violence against Nessus becomes his own death stroke as well. So with Nessus and Heracles, we can see this kind of mirrored, right? This sort of mirrored connection between the violence against others and one's own death, and how those things. So one of the conclusions that I draw from this, therefore, is this link, right? This essential connection between violence and self-destruction. We'll make a distinction there when we get to the next circle, or when we get to the next zone, right? That is the violence against themselves. Those who are violent against others are not violent against themselves in the same way that the violent against themselves are violent against themselves, not quite as literally, and yet it seems to be a common link. To put this another way, let me say, I don't think it's an accident that the violent against themselves are in the center of this circle. They seem to me to be kind of the common, in one sense. I don't want to go too far, but what I'm almost wanting to say, it's almost like the purest example of violence total, right? Like everyone who is guilty of violence, everyone who is guilty of malice by force, is ultimately harming themselves, is ultimately destroying themselves. It's all in Boethius, of course. Yeah, good, Stephen. That's really good. Nessus's blood being used for violence, as well as the blood the other violent are in, seems conspicuous in the light of our discussion about the crucifixion and love associated with Christ's blood. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so one step at a time there, Stephen. Yes, I agree. The fiery poison in the blood of Nessus seems a conspicuous thing to bring up when we've got people standing in like a fiery river of blood, right? So agreed. That connection is another thing that makes Nessus, seems to me to make Nessus like the exemplar of violence against others in a sense, right? That might be too much to say, but he's one of the clearest, one of the ones whose stories we get. He's one of the first that we meet down here, and one of those whose stories we get. And of course, he becomes the guide, right? It is on Nessus that Virgil and Dante ride across the river here. So there's other reasons to see him as really sort of central. But Stephen, you're absolutely right to be thinking of the blood that does not bring destruction, but that brings salvation, right? That brings forgiveness, that wipes away suffering rather than bringing it. Or Stephen, to put that in a different way, to put your same observation the other way round, that the blood of Nessus is like a hellish inversion of the blood shed by Christ, right? Nessus sheds blood as he dies, and through that blood, fiery death and destruction is visited upon his enemy, right? His own blood becomes the instrument of malice, whereas while the earthquake is happening, Jesus's lifeblood is being shed, and that blood is the instrument of forgiveness and mercy. That reversal, that mirror reversal between the blood of Nessus and the blood of Christ, that seems to me a very important, and to point to a very important principle here. Again, to give us a really interesting data point about why is violence such a big deal, right? What does this mean? It isn't just about the act of like raising your hand against someone else in anger, right? About, striking someone or even killing someone. If Nessus is to be taken in some sense as the kind of exemplar here in this circle, then I wonder if it's fair to draw the conclusion that violence against others, understood in this way, it's that what we mean by violence is violence sort of trying to choose my words really carefully, but fundamental deviation from how things are supposed to be, but not like an accidental deviation, right? A rebellion against how things are meant to be. Nessus's violence act, right? Nessus's blood and his death taken in this way, right? Sort of seen juxtaposed against the blood of the crucifixion, is in fact like a mockery of salvation itself. That's a big deal. That would seem like a big deal. And yeah, as Jameson points out, vengeance is a big deal, right? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, except Nessus seems to have laid claim to that too. Jameson, you're right about that. Yeah. And Sylvia, I agree. So much blood is a big deal. I agree. That's the fact that blood, it's blood and fire, right? Blood and fire are the two motifs of this zone, right? Blood and fire. Really of the whole circle, the whole seventh circle is all about blood and fire. Blood and fire in different proportions. Here we're especially heavy on, here we get both, right? In the next zone, we're going to be heavy on the blood, less so on the fire. In the next zone, more on the fire and less so on the blood. But yeah. All right, let's keep thinking here. A little farther on, the centaur stopped above a group that seemed to rise above the boiling blood as far up as their throats. He pointed out one shade alone apart and said, "Within God's bosom he impaled the heart that still drips blood upon the Thames." Then I caught sight of some who kept their heads and even their full chests above the tide, among them many whom I recognized. And so the blood grew always shallower until it only scorched the feet, and here we found a place where we could ford the ditch. So the souls of the damned in this portion, the violent against others, there are different grades of punishment, right? Some are in the fiery blood are up to their necks. Some are up to their, chests or, their midriffs. Others only have their feet in. So this seems to be a difference of degree. Let's see, Thomas, David. No, I'm forgetting this. I'm forgetting his name already. It's a sensational tale of the time, basically. The business about the heart that still drips blood upon the Thames. I'm forgetting already the sainted dude, but it wasn't Beckett. It was a different English dude. Notice who else is down here. Attila is down here. One trend that is very noticeable among those who are violent against others are tyrants. Tyrants who doubtless were guilty of actual physical, they probably killed some folks and led some folks to get killed. But that seems to be not the only or the primary point exactly. Or rather, I think perhaps we should see an extension of that the very act of tyranny itself, of usurpation or tyranny is an act of violence. Because remember, in Virgil's explanation, before we even got here, we were told it's not just murderers who end up down here. Yes, murderers, but also tyrants, also thieves, those who steal others' stuff. That is still violence against other people. It's not only just narrowly literal violence. Yeah, Bruce, I agree. This is a trend that we see. You're right that we've already seen it before. The people we saw it in the Swamp of the Styx, people who are up to different levels, and some of them were submerged completely in the swamp, right? We'll see, again, a similar thing when we get down to the ninth circle, exactly as you're anticipating there, Bruce. This seems to be, again, to me, this seems to come back to the representation of the way in which the physical body is used as a sort of visual manifestation, even a visualization, perhaps, of the spiritual torment being visited upon these people. That kind of measuring stick is often used, like what percentage of your body is submerged in the unpleasant and extremely painful substance, right? That is definitely a trend that happens in multiple places. We saw it even with the heretics, potentially. So yeah, it's definitely a repeated pattern, and seems to be, my association with it is as that kind of a visualization of the different of these different degrees. How do you express the different degrees of suffering, the different degrees of guilt in this area, and that's how it's being visually manifested. Okay. Next zone. There's more we could talk about there, but let's get into the Dark Forest now. Virgil gives Dante a test here. And I don't know how many of you were able to pass this test. It's an Aeneid test. This is Virgil saying, "How carefully did you read my poem, Dante?" So he sees the forest with these trees. And my kind master then instructed me, before you enter farther, know that now you are within the second ring, and shall be here until you reach the horrid sand. Therefore look carefully. You'll see such things as would deprive my speech of all belief. From every side I heard the sound of cries, but I could not see any source for them, so that in my bewilderment I stopped. So he hears the crying of voices, but doesn't see any people. I think that he was thinking that I thought so many voices moaned among those trunks from people who had been concealed from us. I love that line. I think that he was thinking that I thought. Anyway, I think that he was thinking that I thought so many voices moaned among those trunks from people who had been concealed from us. So the suffering people are hiding behind the tree. Yes. Therefore, my master said, if you would tear a little twig from any of these plants, the thoughts you have will also be cut off. Then I stretched out my hand a little way, and from a great thorn bush snapped off a branch, at which its trunk cried out, "Why do you tear me?" Now, I call this a literature test because this is an allusion to a very famous passage in the Aeneid. When Aeneas in the Aeneid first comes to land at a place that he thinks is going to be great to settle down in. Of course, the premise of the Aeneid is Aeneas has escaped with a bunch of Trojan refugees, and they're trying to, they're going to find a new place to build a new city. And so they find a place that looks like it's going to be a great place. And he goes up on this hill, and on this hill, there are these saplings that are growing out of the ground. And he pulls up a sapling. And when he pulls up a sapling, the roots of it drip human blood. And he's very alarmed, understandably, by this, right? So he, being an empiricist, pulls another one up to see what happens. And lo and behold, more blood, right? So he pulls another one up, and and then a voice comes out of the hole, the bloody hole in the ground. And the voice comes out and says, "Ow, knock it off." I'm paraphrasing. In the Latin, it's more elegant. But he's like, "Stop it, that hurts," says the voice coming out of the ground. And he tells him who it is. It's Polydorus, who is a Trojan, who was sent, one of the sons of Priam, I think. Priam had so many sons. I think one of the sons of Priam, whom Priam sent to Thrace. I think it's Thrace. Anyway, to the foreign country where they are, in order to ask for help, in the war against the Greeks. And the local potentate, instead of honoring, the allegiance that, the alliance that they had, murders Polydorus, and leaves his body out on the hillside. And the spears with which they murdered him, the spears they stabbed into his body, those flower into the saplings, right? So the saplings that he's pulling out are the spears that actually killed Polydorus there in his extremely shallow grave. And his voice comes up and says, "Please stop. That hurts a lot." Okay, so that's the famous scene from the Aeneid that Dante is recalling here, and which Virgil seems to, he says, break off a branch. And when he breaks off a branch, blood comes out of the end of the branch, and a voice emerges from the tree, from the tree or the bush. "Why do you tear me?" So it's very like what happens in the Aeneid, but it's also significantly different from what happens in the Aeneid. The way that, Virgil tells him to go do it. You'll understand better once you break off one of those branches, right? So he stirs Dante on to do, and then tries to see if we can figure it out. He's really cagey with Dante here. And it's Dante's memory of the Aeneid that's going to really help him here. So, okay. And then when it had grown more dark with blood, it asked again, "Why do you break me off? Are you without all sentiment of pity? We once were men, and now are arid stumps. Your hand might well have shown us greater mercy, had we been nothing more than souls of serpents. As from a sapling log that catches fire along one of its ends, while at the other it drips and hisses with escaping vapor, so from that broken stump issued together both words and blood. At which I let the branch fall, and I stood like one who is afraid. He reacts just like Aeneas does when Aeneas sees the blood and then hears the voice. And David, I don't know how to parse this either. Like, Dante gets in trouble, right? Like, he gets yelled at by the spirit for breaking off the branch. Why do you break me off? Are you without all sentiments of pity? Well, he's got... Jocelyn, Virgil did set him up. That's exactly what happened, it seems, right? Why? Why do we think Virgil sets him up? Is it because Virgil lacks pity for these souls? That image, by the way, this is one of my favorite epic similes in the whole Inferno. The sapling log, which catches fire on one end and then is dripping and hissing out the other end. That as the metaphor for the way that the blood is sort of spitting and bubbling out the end with the word, like the words emerge from the end of the stick, spitting and hissing with the drops and bubbles of blood that are emerging. It's very evocative, right? Very evocative. And of course, about fire as well, right? I said that this part of the seventh circle is light on fire and heavy on blood. But notice in the simile we get fire. The words and the blood emerging from the end of the stick is as if it's pushed out, right? As if it's sent out by the fire that's burning the other end of the stick, which, it probably is. Yeah, now, Leanne, that's a really, really good point. Leanne says that she's struck by the politeness of this interaction with the tree. The interpretation I'd heard of Dante's reactions to the damned souls he meets as being one of misguided sympathy at first, progressing to righteous anger as he starts to get it, i.e. in the circle of the wrathful. She says, she says, your interpretation is completely different and makes a lot more sense to me, but now I wonder how this encounter fits in. Why are they so nice to the suicide? Yeah, I agree. I agree that I don't think that his righteous anger, or how righteous is it really, his anger in any case, against Filippo Argenti is, I don't think necessarily a sign that he gets it. So I guess I'm kind of harsh, Leon, aren't I, on Dante, that I take both his swooning and apparent sympathy with Paolo and Francesca and his anger against Filippo Argenti, both as bad signs, right? It shows he's not getting it anywhere at all. But you're right, Leanne, that this is different, right? How is it different? Why is it different? Let's keep going, because the pity is, to me, they're asking for pity, right? The tree asks him for pity. You could have had pity. My sage said, wounded soul, if earlier he had been able to believe what he had only glimpsed within my poetry, if he hadn't failed the poetry test, then he would not have set his hand against you. But its incredibility made me urge him to do a deed that grieves me deeply. But tell him who you were, so that he may, to make amends, refresh your fame within the world above, where he can still return. Virgil expresses great pity. Now, yes, he did set Dante up and create this unmerciful situation where additional suffering was inflicted on the tree. The tree soul, or the soul tree, I suppose, more accurately. But he says he didn't do it out of a lack of pity. It grieved him deeply to do that. But he had to. It's Dante's fault. It's Dante's fault. Dante wouldn't have believed him. How does he know Dante wouldn't believe him? Because Dante didn't believe him, right? Had he been a better reader of the Aeneid, he would have understood what was happening here. Stephen, I too see a distinction like that. Stephen says, in prior circles, Dante was drawn in and was sympathizing with the sins, which is wrong. Here, he's not sympathizing with suicide itself, but he's having pity on the soul. Yeah, that does seem to me to be an important difference. The pity towards the person, right? As opposed to sympathy with the experience. He was certainly, if he was having sympathy, it was sympathy with the whole courtly love. It's not that he was like perceiving the soul of Paola or Francesca and saying, oh man, like I feel so bad for you. No, he was like, oh love, I've been there, man. I get it, right? I feel you, right? In which case he wasn't actually feeling them. He was feeling himself, right? With Filippo Argenti, he was feeling anger, right? Which seemed to reflect Filippo Argenti's own frenzy. But here we seem to get pity towards the soul themselves in ways which obviously we didn't get with Filippo Argenti, but I would argue we didn't get with Paolo and Francesca either. So I do think that seems to be somewhat of a difference. And conspicuous, I think, in the circle of the suicides. Sarah Duncan says, is there a benefit to being remembered in the world above in the mindset of the time? It's not the first time it's been mentioned as a positive. Yeah, Sarah, I mean, it seems to be, right? It seems to be. On the one hand, I don't know. Like, on the one hand, it doesn't matter. I mean, we know about fame, right? I mean, check your Boethius if you're wondering whether fame in the world is of any lasting value, right? Spoiler, no. But so, yeah, it's not like that's like the ultimate, like, hey, yeah, you know, doomed to eternal damnation. But here's the positive side. A small number of people in you know, a few, or even hundreds of thousands of people over several centuries are going to speak better of you for a little while. So, you know, I'll let that comfort you, I guess. William, I have always thought the same thing. It's one of the things I don't get about this. I don't get about Virgil in this exchange. I don't feel like I really understand what Virgil's doing here. What William just said was, hang on, the guy in the Aeneid was murdered. And these people are suicides. I agree. There are so many differences. I mean, yes, it's like the whole blood and words thing, yes, is similar. And it's kind of a bloody talking tree in both places. Kinda, right? So it's not that there are no connections. It's not like I can't track with Virgil here. But I agree with William. William says, like, how on earth was he supposed to guess that? Right? I mean, these people aren't murder victims. Not in the way that Polydorus was. I mean, Polydorus, his words were all about how he'd been done wrong, right? And that seems to be quite different from the situation of these suicides. Even if you overlook the sort of difference in framework, which I think is significant, right? Instead of having because the trees growing out of Polydorus were not Polydorus. He was still down in the ground underneath it, right? The tree was the spear. Had Aeneas broken off a bit, you know, a branch from the sapling, it wouldn't have done anything to Polydorus, right? So how is it a fair test? How is it a fair literature test? But, you know, okay, literature test is my own somewhat humorous characterization. What Virgil actually says is, he talks about its incredibility, right? Had I told him these trees are souls, the souls of suicides, he wouldn't have believed me. But I have to admit, William, I have a hard time believing that. I mean, oh, sea of all good sense, right? The way Dante talks to Virgil, like, seriously? Do we really think that had Virgil just been up front with him, right? See this one? Each one of those trees is the soul of a suicide. That Dante's really gonna be like, nah, you gotta be pulling my leg, Virgil. I can swallow a lot of stuff, but don't you start trying to put that on me, right? No way. Really? Yeah, I don't know. Now, you're right, David, and as you might have heard, I was kind of correcting myself on this as I was talking, because you're absolutely right. Suicides are murder victims. That's why they're here. They are murder victims. And this, by the way, is why suicide is a sin. And I know it might see, and please, you know, I meant to say this before we entered the dark wood here. I don't want anyone to feel that I'm being flippant in talking about suicide. I know that there are lots of horrible things that we are talking about in the course of Inferno, but I know also that the circle of the suicides is a little bit more triggering, perhaps, than many of the other things that we're looking at. And I don't want to be insensitive to that, or seem to be insensitive to that. I mean, I am going to discuss what we see, and I am going to talk about the medieval attitude towards it, which was very different from the modern attitude towards it. And the primary, their approach to it was fundamentally logical. It was, and it remains a perfectly rational understanding of the situation with suicide. Suicide is a sin because it's murder. You're killing someone. It happens to be yourself, but you don't have the right to kill yourself any more than you have the right to kill someone else. It remains, again, they were very logical about this. Logically, it remains murder. Now, you will hear it said that suicide is one of the like suicides are like not buried in consecrated ground. Why is that? Why are suicides not buried in consecrated ground? Answer: because suicides, and suicides alone, medieval Christians could know, are going to hell, right? If a bad person dies, I mean, a horrible person, you know that person is a horrible person. You can't be 100% sure that that person is in hell. You could suspect, right? You could have a pretty good suspicion that that horrible, horrible person who just died is probably burning in hell right now, right? But you can't know for sure, right? Because maybe they repented, right? Maybe they repented on their deathbed. You don't know, and that can happen. They could have achieved forgiveness and atonement, and be in purgatory right now, right? You don't know. You can't be sure. But you can be sure about suicides. Why? No opportunity for repentance. It's not possible. The act of their death is their sin. In the moment of death, they commit a mortal sin, which is murder, right? They kill someone in the moment of their death. And it is not possible for them to repent of it afterwards, right? Because there's no afterwards. They're already dead. So again, that's why the medievals are very logical about things like this. We tend to put feelings above logic sometimes, or to resist logic for the sake of feelings. It's not that they never did that, but they really liked logically worked out systems, and that's why according to the rigid logic the almost inescapable logic of the medieval moral system. Suicides all of them go to hell. That was the doctrine, and that's the reason behind the doctrine. Yeah, Stephen, I was thinking about that loophole too. Could they, stab themselves and then while they're exsanguinating, repent? I mean, look, on the one hand, Stephen, that's exactly that question has to be asked somewhere. Stephen, I would bet you $5 that there is a medieval moralist who asked and answered that question, because this is exactly the kind of question that they were always interested in. They didn't like loopholes, and they liked to think it through. Or slow poison, Jennifer. Exactly. Oh, right. Or Bruce says, if you jump from a high enough height, you could conceivably have time to repent while you're falling. Admittedly, but it's true, David. It's not just about repentance. You've got to confess to a priest as well. But see, even there can be exceptions. It is not necessarily true that anyone who does not do final confession and receive last rites is in hell. I mean, if you just because you have a heart attack and fall off your horse one day, and die does not mean you're in hell. So the mediation of a priest is important, but it's not the same. It doesn't achieve the same kind of logical necessity as the other. Right. No, I mean, there are lots of ways that one can die suddenly without the opportunity to be shriven before one dies. Jennifer, what's the benefit of being buried in consecrated ground? There are superstitions about that, but there's no mechanism there. What happens to your body after death isn't going to affect the destiny of your soul. Notice Dante got rid of that. Remember, that was true for Virgil, right? Those who died and were unburied were there lingering outside of Hades, wishing they could get in, right? Dante removes the unburied and replaces it, remember, with the non-committal. So the whole question of what happens to your corpse after death, Dante certainly seems to be removing from the equation. Of course, both David and Williams are thinking of the natural, the importance of the consecrated ground. It has to do with protecting against vampirism, but that is a different conversation that we will not have at this time. But I'm not saying you're wrong. Anyway, okay. So again, although I'm laughing, and again, I hope that nobody thinks that I'm taking the question of suicide lightly. And as I said, I understand the way in which this is, this whole canto can be a really sort of triggering thing for people. But as readers of Dante, we are going to need to take a coldly logical look at the situation and see how it fits into the whole system, into the big picture that that Dante is describing here. Okay. Refreshing the fame, though, back to that question. All I can say is that it is interesting to me. It is interesting to me that Virgil seems to be in favor of this. Interesting to me on a couple different levels. A, it matters for real. I mean, if you had told me, right, like blindfold on before I read the book for the first time, if you'd asked me, does Virgil, like somebody says, oh, like we should tell good stories about the dead folks in hell back up on earth to increase their reputation among the living. Does that matter much? Is that a good thing, or does it not matter? If you'd asked me before, I'd have said, no, of course. He's read, everybody, Boethius, right? It's all in Boethius. No, fame is fleeting and deceptive. It doesn't matter. But I'd be wrong, right? Because Virgil talks like it does matter. So that's one level in which it's interesting and not quite what I would have expected. The second reason that it's interesting and not quite what I would have expected is that, this kind of pity, this idea of doing a good turn to the damned soul, right? Like even the kind of pity that Virgil is showing is that, wasn't it Virgil who explained that everybody who's down here in circles 7 and below are the objects of the special anger of the Almighty? Virgil is showing pity, or expressing pity in any case. Maybe not showing so much with the whole, break off a branch and see what happens thing. But anyway, expressing it, saying that he feels it. But is that a good thing? Maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe both of these things are signs of Virgil not quite getting it. I'm not sure. Let's keep going, see what we think. Okay. So of course the guy is a political guy again. He was servant of Frederick, wasn't it Frederick? Anyway, one of the Holy Roman emperors. So which means, remember, politically he's on the good side from Dante's perspective. Dante is pro-monarchist, down with the popes in the political world of 13th and 14th century Italy. So politically speaking, this guy is one of the good guys, not one of the bad guys like Farinata or Filippo Argenti that he met earlier on. Okay, so here's his explanation of how things work. My mind, because of its disdainful temper, believing it could flee disdain through death, this is the tree talking still, made me unjust against my own just self. I swear to you by the peculiar roots of this thorn bush, I never broke my faith with him who was so worthy, with my Lord. So like after this guy's death, people have been bad-mouthing him, right? People have been saying that he was a traitor to the emperor. And he's like, no. I was unjust, but only against myself, right? In committing suicide, I was unjust, but I was unjust against my own just self. I swear to you by the peculiar roots of this thorn bush, I never broke my faith with him who was so worthy, with my Lord. If one of you returns into the world, then let him help my memory, which still lies prone beneath the battering of envy. The poet waited briefly. Then he said to me, since he is silent, do not lose this chance, but speak and ask what you would know. And I, do you continue? Ask of him whatever you believe I should request. I cannot. So much pity takes my heart. Dante can't even ask questions because he is also overcome with pity for this soul who's being done wrong, not in hell, as presumably divine justice knew what it was doing, but on earth, right, with his reputation, which is being remedied as we speak, right? Dante is overcome by his pity. Is this a good thing? It feels like a good thing, right? Just like, and that's a really squishy way to say it, but just as the Filippo Argenti incident felt all wrong, right? This doesn't feel wrong, but I don't know. I'm always nervous. I'm always nervous. Like, does that mean I'm the sucker here? Like, am I, just as I think there is a little bit of suckering going on back in Canto 5, right? I as I said before, I think that if we read the story of Paolo and Francesca and we come out of it saying like, oh, the beautiful love affair, like, oh, that's so sad, like what their love was so beautiful, then we're tumbling, right? We're tumbling around the second circle, right? Not that it's a joke. If it's a joke, it's a very dark joke, but the joke's on us, right? If we're thinking that way, that's what I mean, like by being suckered. So I don't know if that's what's happening here. And I will say that I feel I have a particularly difficult time. I have a particularly difficult time with this one in this context, because I personally, within my own cultural context, do feel strongly inclined to feel pity towards people who commit suicide. And so therefore, I am the more naturally inclined to side with Virgil and Dante and their expressions of pity here. But I am not confident that my own feelings and my societal values are steering me right, if you see what I mean. Like it feels good, it feels right, but I'm not sure that it's actually giving me the correct steer. Do you see what I mean by that? This often happens. This often happens. And this is definitely a place. I am aware of the fact that this is one of those places where there is a major disjunction between my culture and Dante's culture, right? That like the visceral reaction to the concept of suicide is very different in the modern world and in the medieval world. I'm not saying it's not like people didn't get sad when somebody they knew committed suicide, right? It's not like they, in many ways they would have responded to like the suicide of a family member in similar ways to the way that modern people react to the suicide of a family member. I'm not saying it's utterly different, but there would have been very significant differences. They certainly would have felt some things that modern people would not feel. So anyway, so I'm not sure what to do. In the end, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure what to do either with their pity or with the question of shame, of the reputation of the tree dude, and the restoration of his reputation. It's not that that's a bad thing. It's just, if accepting the framework of the narrative here, it's truth, right? It's, so like letting people should know what really happened instead of what didn't happen, that they should know the truth instead of lies is good. Like, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with going back and doing this, but, the thing that is a stumbling block for me is the idea that the ultimate status of the tree is changed in any substantive way by this correction, right? Especially when we get into the description of what happens. Then he began again. Imprisoned spirit, so may this man do freely what you ask. May it please you to tell us something more of how the soul is bound into these knots, and tell us if you can, if anyone can ever find his freedom from these limbs. Does anybody ever make it from being a tree, a suicide tree, to being, a real boy again? At this the trunk breathed violently. Then that wind became this voice. You shall be answered promptly. When the savage spirit quits the body from which it has torn itself, Then Minos sends it to the seventh maw. It falls into the wood, and there's no place to which it is allotted, but wherever fortune has flung that soul, that is the space where, even as a grain of spelt, it sprouts. Grain of spelt is like a grain of wheat. Okay. It's a particular kind of grain of wheat, but I don't know much about spelt. Anyway, okay. So we're going to go on to the next slide in just a second, because he's going to talk about the bigger things too, or the like more eternal things as well. But first, okay. So how does it work? Randomness. There's no place to which it's allotted, right? The soul is just chucked down into the seventh ring, and it falls somewhere by fortune, right? Wherever fortune has flung that soul. It doesn't have a designated place. Why? It has abdicated its designated place, right? When the savage spirit quits the body from which it has torn itself. So the act of suicide is the spirit tearing itself from the body. Again, it's not a bodily sin, it's a spiritual sin. It tears itself from the body. It commits this ultimate violence against itself. But you see, the violence against it's not just as violence against others is not just murder, so violence against the self is not just murder also, right? Yes, it is the act of murder, and everyone here is a murderer and also a murder victim. But there's a deeper sense in which they are committing violence against themselves. They are unseating themselves. They are removing themselves. Spoiler, when we get up to paradise, we will find that all the blessed souls have an appointed spot. There's a seat reserved. It's like the round table, with the where Merlin in gold letters puts the names of folks on the back in advance, and the names appear. Like that's in advance in some cases, less so in others. It's kind of how heaven is, right? There's a seat for everybody. When the savage spirit quits the body from which it has torn itself, it has no seat anymore. It just drops down into the wood. And wherever it has been flung, it sprouts. So it grows, so it bears fruit. Yeah, now, David, of course, I can't help but remember that, too. We were just talking about fortune a little while ago, and David says that, shouldn't we take the invocation of fortune as an indication that God has a plan for where things go, even if the souls can't perceive it? Probably. Probably, yeah. Maybe. But of course, David, it's also possible that where the seed falls is genuinely random as a consequence of, or even as an expression of being cast out by God. Right? But but then what happens? It rises as a sapling, a wild plant. And then the harpies, feeding on its leaves, cause pain, and for that pain provide a vent. Like other souls, we shall seek out the flesh that we have left, but none of us shall wear it. It is not right for any man to have what he himself has cast aside. We'll drag our bodies here. They'll hang in this sad wood, each on the stump of its vindictive shade. This, for my money, is one of the most horrible things in all of hell. The resurrection of the body is a universal thing. And we've heard people talk about it before. Dante's asked a couple questions about this. What's going to happen after the resurrection of the body? The souls in hell are all bodiless right now. They're all intangible spirits because they don't have their bodies anymore. But the day will come when their bodies will be raised and their spirits will be rejoined to their bodies. And as Virgil has already told us, that will be for them the perfection of their suffering, right? But the suicides won't be reunited with their bodies, or they will, but they won't be reconnected, right? So their spirits will go and seek out their flesh, but they will not wear the flesh, since they have cast it away, because they have destroyed themselves, because they ripped their own spirits out of their body. Their choice, as we've seen in other cases, their choice will be perpetuated in their punishment in hell. And their choice, their sinful choice, was savagely to rip their own spirits out of their own bodies. And that separation, the separation between soul and body that they chose in the act, will be perpetuated continually. Not just by having their bodies right there, but not being able to be connected to their bodies. Their souls will remain in the form of trees, and their bodies will be crucified on the trees. Yeah, I agree, Bruce. That is dark with a capital D. Their own bodies will be crucified on the tree. They will become the trees upon which their bodies are eternally crucified. They will carry their bodies eternally, but be unable to be joined by them. And in the joining, right, the nearness of the body, right, the almost joining of body and soul, that will itself be a cause of continual torment for the tree, right? The body presumably is not going to be experiencing suffering, probably, because the soul's not connected to it. But the body itself, the abandoned body, becomes itself the instrument of torment. Yeah, I say crucifixion because it's hanging on the tree. Yeah, they'll hang in this sad wood, each on the stump of its vindictive shade. Perhaps I'm overstepping there, David, but it, like, hanging on the tree it's very crucifixion-like in any case. It's also Judas-like, I will admit. It also seems like each one of them sort of recapitulates not the betrayal of Judas, but the suicide of Judas. Yeah. But Stephen, yeah, it's like whether it's hanging, in either case, it's going to hurt the tree. It's going to, I think the principle remains. But, I don't know. Crucifixion still just seems to me a more apt sort of thing. But anyway, but yes, it's a punishment for the tree, not for the one hanging. So even there, Stephen, we see like a reversal, right? Anyway, back to pity. If we go back a second, the question which led to this revelation, right? Virgil's question: imprisoned spirit, so may this man do freely what you, in order so that this guy can, Dante, that is, can, tell the truth about you up in the world when he gets back. May it please you to tell us something more of how the soul is bound in these knots, and tell us, if you can, if anyone can ever find his freedom from these limbs. One might paraphrase that: will God ever feel pity for them? Will God ever show mercy to the suicides? And the answer, no. No. They too, like the other souls in hell, will perpetuate. They are left to continue and perpetuate the choices they made in life. The violent, those who have done the violent against themselves, continually recapitulate that act of self-destruction. And this is what brings me back to, so the pity, is that good or bad? You know, if we're feeling pity for the suicides, spiritually speaking, again, within the framework of the poem, the moral framework of the poem, is that a bad thing? Is the pity of Virgil and Dante here as bad a sign as their anger against Filippo Argenti? It's not the same. I don't think it's the same situation as that. But I can't help but wonder. But pity seems to me the overall tone or note, I guess, of Canto 13. Notice also, another thing that I find interesting about it is the way pain is inflicted. Being a tree is bad. I mean, because you're meant to be a person. So if you're a tree now, that means you've been pushed down the great chain of being. Remember I talked about cumulative souls, right? How like we have the same souls as, we have the same souls as plants and we have the same souls as animals. We can do more, right? We can do everything they can do, but we can also do something else. And that's kind of how the way it works all the way down to rocks. They've been demoted, right? Straight past animals and down to plants. And that's bad, ontologically speaking. While retaining the awareness of humans. But that's not their only punishment. The physical pain they experience when damage is done to the branches, right? The pain they experience when you break off the branch. And then, of course, right after this, we're going to have the two people who still have human shape. One of whom is going to go, like, diving and tripping into a bush, and he's going to break it all to pieces, right? I mean, so there's, like, all these branches, like, broken and hanging off this bush. And after he leaves, well, gets ripped to shreds, the bush is like, ow, that really hurt. Why did you inflict all this suffering on me? In other words, the pain experienced by the trees down here seems to be optional, transitory. It's not like, it's very different from standing in a river of fire, of fiery blood, right? Like, the pain might be at different levels, right? Depending on where you're standing for those who are violent against others, but the pain is a constant, right? There's no escaping it. There's also no making it worse, right? Unless, I guess, you get shot in the face by a centaur, but generally there's no making it worse. Here, until something breaks off a branch, they seem to be fine. Now, the harpies come around and do this a lot anyway, so, like, they're bad news. It's not like you could totally, permanently escape pain. Yeah, Leanne says they've descended into mad vegiosity. Yeah, it's like mad bestiality, except more green. Yeah. And so, David is, of course, remembering the harpies as well. I mean, there are creatures down here whose job it is to rip trees up on the regular. So, again, it's not like they're going to be escaping pain completely, but again, I bring this up as relevant to the pity question, right? Because here's what I'm trying to get at. We see souls down here in two different invariable states of suffering. That's the thing that I'm trying to get at. There's variable states, right? There's the steady state, the just being a tree state, right? And then there's the I'm a broken, bleeding tree in pain state, right? So where, as we might feel pity for the trees, there's like this extra surge of pity for the poor bush after the dude runs over it and the dog runs over it and it's all broken and shattered, right? And it's lying there like, ow, ow. I mean, there's like this extra spike of pity, right? The sufferings of people in almost every other circle that we've seen are even, right? They're constant. What I'm pointing at here is that evoking these sort of spikes of pity seems to be one of the features of this canto and of our encounters in this circle, which again, so I again can't help but feel that my own response of pity is being aggressively manipulated by Dante throughout this canto. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure if Dante's trying to teach me a lesson about that. Okay, no, I think he's definitely trying to teach me a lesson, but I'm not sure which direction he's teaching. Am I being cautioned against this kind of pity? Or am I being enjoined to this kind of pity? I'm not 100% certain. So there's my dilemma. But we can't forget, it's not just trees and it's not just suicides that are punished down here in this zone, right? Behind these two, so these two naked human figures come running across, right? And they're being pursued by black hounds. Behind these two, black bitches filled the wood, and they were just as eager and as swift as greyhounds that have been let off their leash. They set their teeth in him where he had crouched, and piece by piece those dogs dismembered him and carried off his miserable limbs. Then he who was my escort took my hand. He led me to the lacerated thorn that wept in pain where it was bleeding, broken. "O Jacopo," it said, "de Santo Andrea, what have you gained by using me as a screen? Am I to blame for your indecent life?" So the naked people who get ripped up by hounds here and in the process end up causing more pain to the trees are also violent against themselves. What do? You remember what they did? We were told, Virgil mentioned it before. What are the non-tree people guilty of? Violence against themselves. But like, what is their actual act? Do you remember? Virgil mentioned it a while back. Squandering their patrimony. They squandered their patrimony. So just as the violent against others might have ended up in the Styx, but they ended up down here in the seventh circle instead, these dudes, these other dudes in the, back with Nessus. So those who squandered their patrimony were like, wait, aren't they prodigal? Isn't that what prodigality is? Isn't that exactly what the prodigal son did, was squander his patrimony? Yes. But again, it's the same thing, right? Like, presumably a murderer was also wrathful, or like many murderers are wrathful, but they didn't end up in the wrath place. They ended up down here in the violence against others place. So too, yes, those who squander their patrimony are prodigal, but those who... but they don't end up just with the avaricious rolling boulders up there in the fourth circle. They're down here, and they're in the violent against themselves. Squandering your patrimony. Of course, it's a subset of prodigality, but it's not just any old garden variety prodigality. It is like suicide. It is one thing to go from rags to riches and back to rags again. That's perfectly normal, right? So, kid from a poor neighborhood who gets drafted in the first round of the NFL draft and makes millions of dollars as an NFL player, and then blows all of his money on fast cars and strip clubs, and ends up poor at the end, is not going to end up here. He's not committed fundamental violence against himself. He was just prodigal. He's going to be pushing boulders, most likely. Again, not knowing it, but maybe he'd repent, of course. But anyway, that's garden variety prodigality. This is squandering your patrimony. So you have your inheritance from your father, right? You have your family lands, your family business, your family inheritance, and you blow that. That is like unto suicide. That is violence against yourself. That is, in its way, like the equivalent of thieves, right? Just as murderers of other people are obviously violent against others, but thieves who break in and steal other people's stuff are also violent against others, even if they don't actually harm them or injure them physically. So those who squander their own patrimony are also violent against themselves, like the suicides. Now, notice, I don't think they're going to be without their bodies when it comes time, when it comes the last trumpet call, because they're still in physical human shape here, right? They are not guilty of the violent separation of their souls from their own bodies. And so that isn't what's going to be perpetuated. What is perpetuated? They're ripped up into pieces and dragged off in lots of different directions, just like their patrimony, right? Just like their family estate, just like their family inheritance, right? As it gets squandered and dragged off by different of their creditors, right? So their spiritual bodies down here are torn apart and dragged around. David, I agree. Their nudity, I think, is significant here. As he says, they've thrown away their wealth, so they don't get to cover themselves. Yes. They have nothing, right? They have nothing, and the representation of themselves, their apparent bodies, are being ripped up and torn apart and dragged away. Jennifer says, do they reassemble? Yeah, I think so. I doubt that dude, Jacopo da Santo Andrea, was just permanently annihilated. And I suspect that he's going to reassemble in order to be ripped apart again. That's we're not told that explicitly, but yeah, I do assume that there's a reassembly process. How much that looks like Terminator 2, I'm not sure, Jennifer, but they reassemble. They reassemble. I would assume they do, since a short-term punishment like that, which is quickly over, which is bad but quickly over, it seems to be counterindicated in the landscape of hell in general. And yes, it should remind us of Prometheus, whose liver grows back every night so that the eagle can rip it out again every morning. Exactly. Yep, agreed. Jocelyn, I agree. Kind of like Groundhog Day, except a horrible version of Groundhog Day. Yes, exactly. Good. Okay. We won't move on we did 2 of the 3 zones of the violent here tonight. We'll move on to the violent against God next time, which is appropriate because the violent against God is itself going to be subdivided into 3 different zones. So we'll say we probably won't even get through the whole violent against God section next time, but we'll at least begin it. So thank you guys for joining me tonight. This has been, as always, a really fun discussion. Thank you for helping me to work through some of my ideas here tonight and for giving so many of your own good ideas. And I look forward next week to continuing our discussion. So thanks very much, everybody, and I will see you guys later. Bye now.